Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome everyone to a fresh episode of All Things Policy. We have a very special guest today. Kailash is here with us. He is the Chief Technology Officer of Zerodha. And as the dust settles down on the global tech outage in July 2024, we now today sit down to discuss the long-term lessons from this tech outage. We would also discuss Kailash's ideas on software as a discipline and his thoughts on open source software. So those are the broad themes we'll discuss. So welcome, Kailash, to All Things Policy.
Thank you.
Yeah, so before I start posing questions to you, I'll first give a brief intro to what exactly unfolded in July so that our listeners have an idea. So on July 19, millions of computer systems worldwide began crashing and across industries, from airline companies to hospitals, from tech companies to broadcasters, even banks and retail outlets, everyone was impacted. According to Microsoft's estimate, about 8.5 million devices, which are less than 1% of Windows devices, were affected in the tech outage. The outage was initially confused as a Microsoft outage, but was actually due to CrowdStrike's faulty update. More specifically, the Windows devices hosting CrowdStrike's cybersecurity product Falcon sensor that were online between 0409 UTC and 0527 UTC, about 78 minutes in that window. Whichever device received that faulty update crashed and displayed a blue screen of death. Mac and Linux devices were not particularly impacted, and enterprise users were more impacted as compared to individual users. And there are estimates which say that billions of dollars were wiped out or lost in this global outage. Now, this was not a cyber attack. This was not the doing of a malicious actor. What is being touted as the biggest tech outage in history was actually caused by a mere 40 KB file, which now known as the infamous Channel 5291, that was pushed as an update by CrowdStrike for its Falcon sensor. So with that, I'll now jump to you, Kailash. What were your initial views the moment you saw these thing unfolding in July? What did you think as a tech person?
I thought it was just a matter of time that something like this was inevitable, and more things like this are going to happen because the way we've digitally connected global systems in a discipline which is still highly immature, software and technology and internet-based technologies and massive connectivity as a discipline, these things are extremely nascent, right? Just a couple of decades, the way they've evolved to be. So zero surprises, and it was I was just reflecting on the way how the globe has become highly centralized and connected. You pick any technological service that we avail today as an end user or as a business, they're all large, massive centralized platforms. Everybody uses Gmail. What happens when Gmail goes down? Everybody uses the same search engine. Everybody uses this exact same social network. Billions of people. These are platforms that have billions of people. So what happened with CrowdStrike, it wasn't a piece of end user consumer technology. It was something that nobody even knew existed. These are back-end system, internal systems that run, on servers and devices that lay buried deep beneath many levels of abstractions before the end user sees something. So when something went wrong, and it was just one mistake, probably caused by one technical person, just one of those extremely unfortunate random days where a mistake is made. And the issue wasn't that a mistake was made. That happens all the time in all human disciplines. And when you're working with large, complex technological systems, mistakes are made. But the impact that one mistake could have was crazy. It was so disproportionate and outsized. But like I said, there was nothing to be surprised about there, because if millions of systems worldwide, if hundreds of thousands of organizations all depend on one software vendor pushing updates to a remote via remote black box, this is bound to happen. So this was just one of the many to come.
Thanks, Kailash, for your initial take on this. Yes, I did read your writing on this in your blog, where you ruminated on your, what this tech outage means for software as such. And you wrote about software as a discipline and how it has evolved in a very short period as compared to other disciplines. But we'll come to that. First, I'd like to ask you a very specific question. So,
Yeah.
you wrote that the probability of cascading failures can be reduced by following approaches such as open source, decentralizational, interoperability, federation, open specs, and standards. This is what you argued.
Yeah.
But does open source really reduce cascading failures? And the second question related to this is, how do proprietary software and open source software fare against each other on fault tolerance?
So just because a piece of technology is open source does not mean that it inherently has technical properties that avoid cascading failure. That has nothing to do with open source or closed source. To avoid cascading failure, the architecture of these systems, how they're deployed, how they're envisioned, how they're connected, it really comes down to that. But the inherent nature of open source software, how they're built, how they're consumed, how they're community maintained, how they are held accountable publicly, it has certain properties that push against automated, implicit, and natural centralization. If you are one large proprietary software vendor, you offer a service, then it's in your incentive to just offer that service all over the place, build a large centralized business from a financial perspective also. If you're an open source project, the concept of a large centralized offering of that open source project generally is largely diminished. And there'll be many actors and players and organizations and tech communities who all pick up these pieces of open source software or a particular piece of open source software and they use it in the way they want. So the inherent flexibility, choice, freedom, and openness of open source software naturally results in a state where there's a lot of decentralization. You don't have to tell people that be decentralized. That's the very nature of it. You take it and you do whatever you want with it. With a proprietary piece of software, you have no choice. Somebody gives it to you, you use it, or you don't use it. That's it. So when combined with other broader ideas and principles of building technology, like you mentioned, decentralization, interoperability, when combined with these concepts and open source lends itself very smoothly and naturally to these concepts, then inherently the nature of technology deployment and development globally largely become decentralized, where different pieces act as checks and balances to each other. So it's in that sense. And your second question was about proprietary software versus open source software when it comes to stability, wasn't it?
Fault tolerance.
Fault tolerance, yes, yeah. Uh, Again, the same principle applies there. Just because a project's source code is out there in the open, just because a piece of technology is open source, does not magically make it uh, fault tolerant. It entirely comes down to the technical quality of that project, how much thought has gone into it, how much skills and time and effort has gone into it. However, just by a certain project being open for others to study, change, reuse, scrutinize, just by that implicit virtue of it being open, you have a lot more eyeballs, you have a lot more participation, you have a lot more users trying to break it and crack it in many different ways. You have a lot more users trying to change it to suit their needs. And this ends up in a scenario where lots of people are taking this one piece of technology and using it in ways that you can't even imagine. And because of the collaborative nature of open source, when things go wrong in all these decentralized use cases, people come back. They report bugs, they send code contributions. So inherently, this nature ensures that a piece of open source technology gets a lot more eyeballs and participation and collaboration and skills. And there's a lot of people out there whose incentive it is to improve this particular piece of technology because they like it. And they have the choice and ability to study it, fix it, change it, etc. So it all keeps coming back. Now, if you pick a closed source software, a vendor gives you a black box piece of technology and you use it or you don't use it. There's nothing beyond that. You can't change it, you can't improve it, you can't study it, you can't understand it, you can't use it in ways that it wasn't envisioned by the vendor largely. So just the nature of it ends up in two different states completely. So open source by default by virtue of it being open and collaborative and open to scrutiny, open to change, open to malleability on a large scale, probabilistically, it would have much more robustness and fault tolerance. And that has been the experience. And there's, if you look at the evidence out there, that is really how it is.
Thanks, Kailash. But don't you think it will also depend on how good a community that particular open source project has? For instance, there may be many open source projects out there on the internet available for us to use, which don't have a great community which monitors it every now and then very frequently. And these software products may have more vulnerabilities as compared to proprietary ones. So it may depend on the community also.
Oh, it absolutely depends. That's why I earlier said probabilistic. The probability of a piece of open source software, which has wide usage, wide adoption, being way more robust than a closed source thing is high. It's always, everything is a probability game, but the probability here is significantly high. Now imagine there's a piece of open source software that nobody really uses or is used by a tiny community. Then, of course, the probability of it being high quality or it being held to scrutiny by a large audience diminishes. But there's always a choice. You can always go pick something else up that is much more robust. Or if you don't like it and you like this one particular piece of thing and you have an issue with it, you can fork it and improve it yourself. So all these possibilities are inherent to open source. These possibilities do not even exist when it comes to proprietary software.
Yeah, thanks, Kailash. But I would say that, yes, I get your probability perspective. But would it be wise to say that even if we were to phase out all proprietary softwares in the market right now, let's say everything we are going to use, even enterprise or users, is going to be open source, and we have this huge constellation, global constellation of open source softwares interlinked in complex ways with multiple single points of failure, even then there's a possibility, right? And a very good possibility that something going wrong can have a cascading impact. So that is possible, right?
Yes, yes, yes. That has got nothing to do with open source versus proprietary. That's in the very nature of connected systems, complex, chaotic systems. But if these technologies are open source and out there, the probability of stuff being caused, like this CrowdStrike incident, diminishes. CrowdStrike, like I said, nobody even knew such a thing existed until everything went wrong. But if it was an open source piece of technology, which was community run, used widely, understood widely by community, the probability would have been really low of such a cascading incident happening. But can it happen? Of course. That's the nature of complex connected systems.
Thanks, Kailash. We'll discuss more on that later. But first, back to CrowdStrike and the very model CrowdStrike follows, and that is enterprise endpoint security, wherein millions of devices are getting these auto updates over the internet, and these cybersecurity sensors, they are running at the kernel level.
Yeah.
So this model you have criticized in your piece as well.
Yeah.
So what do you think can be an alternative model for endpoint security? Or do we need to completely reimagine how we do cybersecurity for enterprises?
Just like with most complex problems, the answer must lie in between somewhere. And there may be many different answers here. So a complete reimagination of cybersecurity in itself may be warranted. It's very difficult to sit down and spec out saying, here's the new way of doing it, because it is such a large, complex problem. But there are some immediate common sense steps. Now imagine there's one opaque company, proprietary software vendor based out of the US, is pushing updates to millions of devices, servers, critical systems worldwide. So all you need to do today is just to go, if there's a malicious actor, they just have to compromise this one company. Now that in itself is like forget technology, that in itself sounds like a big no-no with just a common sense yardstick, right? So then the idea would be to remove that centralization. Before we even get to the technical aspects of endpoint security, how those technologies should run, there ideally should not be one company sitting out somewhere pushing out critical updates to systems which it has root access to. That in itself is a mega security hole. Now you don't have to compromise millions of organizations, you just have to compromise one. That's what we saw with SolarWinds, which happened 4-5 years ago, the supply chain attack, right? So this whole supply chain attack as a series of attacks has become really, really lucrative because it's so easy. Then how should we do endpoint security? Like I said, I don't have a definitive or clear answer. I don't know if anybody has, but this centralization should be removed. A simple technical measure would be to have multiple nodes, multiple entry points. If I'm a large organization, I'll host the source of the central control plane or whatever it is inside the org itself. So if something goes wrong, this org is affected, not millions of other orgs. So rather than having one mega global centralized point of failure, distribute it. Let every large org have its own internal self-hosted control plane. And many orgs will not have the capacity to do that. There could be 5, 10, 20 member orgs. So maybe there could be other service providers who offer it. Imagine if instead of one CrowdStrike, there were, let's say, hundreds and hundreds of different CrowdStrikes, all offering a similar piece of technology, endpoint security technology, but them being the central hubs. That in itself would have reduced the impact by a factor of 100 or 1,000 or 10,000, whatever. So that's a very common sense, simple, technical thing. Very doable also that can be done.
Thanks, Kailash. I have two follow-up questions for you. First is, you spoke about the issue with kernel level access. My question to you is, can endpoint security be done effectively if kernel level access is not provided?
Yes. The thing is, even when we use the term endpoint security, it's not one thing. It can mean many, many things. It can mean very specific technical things. It can also mean slightly more philosophical things. Securing a mobile phone, which is an endpoint, versus securing a server, which is another endpoint, which is versus securing an air-gapped server. This is all endpoint security, but they all mean completely different, absolutely completely different things. I could have an internet-connected smartwatch, and that also requires security. So this endpoint security for a smartwatch versus a phone versus a laptop versus a server versus a mainframe are all completely, absolutely different things. So can endpoint security be done without extremely privileged root access on a system? Yes, there are many, many ways. There are many different techniques. It all depends on how we analyze the security threat vector also. The threat vector a server faces is not the same as one that my phone faces. So it absolutely entirely depends on that. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of different technical methods, non-technical methods, which can be applied, which wouldn't need, let's say, root access to a system. Ideally, it should all be done based on the threat vectors that these different scenarios face. There's no one size fit all. There's no one size endpoint security as a concept.
Thanks, Kailash. And my second follow-up question to you is, and this flows from what you spoke about nodes, right? Rather than having it at one centralized place, maybe in different organizations you have those nodes. So one thing that I've noticed that has happened of recently is the disempowerment of in-house IT teams. So a lot of not large level, but maybe mid-level enterprises across the world nowadays are increasingly relying on third-party vendors to take care of cybersecurity needs, right? What this does is, in this particular case, for instance, the CrowdStrike one, had there been IT teams which first received this update, examined it, and then pushed it to maybe one or two systems just to check it, do the due diligence, and then push it out to all the systems in their organization, probably we wouldn't have seen such a cascading impact, right? What happened in this case is the updates were auto pushed over the internet to all the devices, millions of devices. So there were no checks and balances in place. So do you think we need to empower our in-house IT teams for all these companies?
I think this also is not really a black and white matter. Is it practical for millions and millions of organizations, small and big, to have enough technical expertise in house to understand and analyze these things? I don't think it's practical. And that's why I go back to my earlier point of software and technology as a discipline. It is so nascent, it is absolutely so nascent that it is not even possible, it's not even viable to build such technical expertise. Technology itself, many of these technologies that we refer to, specific one like endpoint security as a concept, these are things that evolve drastically, rapidly. These things change. There are breakthroughs every year, every 6 months. So as a discipline, it is so nascent and immature that it's not even possible to do that. But does that mean that we shouldn't attempt? Of course not. We should attempt. A slightly different example, millions of organizations have people in-house who understand finance, let's say basic finance, how to do bookkeeping. And if you go back several decades or whatever, many organizations probably would not have had that capacity. But bookkeeping, accounting, etc., has evolved as a discipline over many centuries to a point where even a 3-member org, tiny shop, has basic finance bookkeeping abilities. So for cybersecurity and technology, and these are deeply technical matters, right? You must understand an entire universe before you start understanding cybersecurity and threat vectors, like an entire universe of technologies. So that is really not viable, which is why I was saying earlier, instead of one CrowdStrike, it's better to have thousands, if not tens of thousands of CrowdStrikes. But is it possible to have millions and millions of cybersecurity experts deeply embedded within every organization right now, today? Impossible. But we might inevitably get there over a very long period of time, decades, centuries, I don't really know. And this whole thing about in-house IT teams getting disempowered, I mean, this whole digitally connected internet tech scenario is just literally 20, 25 years old, really, literally, right? So it's too early to even say that. I think we'll go through multiple cycles of outsourcing, in-housing versus outsourcing, in-housing. I mean, that entire cycle has to play out before people or society truly settles on the most optimum measure. For many organizations, outsourcing is the only way. For many organizations, doing in-house is the right way. But this right or wrong, that balance really has to play out over a long period of time.
So, Kailash, one thing I liked about your take on this is that even though you are yourself deeply embedded in the global cyber internet ecosystem as an actor, as a software programmer, right? You're tinkering with the software. But at the same time, you can take 2 steps back and think from a very long term perspective how software has evolved. And that brings me to your idea of software as a discipline that has only had few decades to develop, as opposed to civil engineering and medicine, which have been in development as disciplines for centuries. So, does this means that ideally we should collectively be more humble and cautious about software usage because it's very recent, right? And on the contrary, what we have become is more confident about software solving social problems, even as our understanding of software as a discipline is quite limited. So, how do you see this contradiction? On the one hand, we are super confident about software solving problems, and on the other, we understand very little.
I think it's classical, typical human foolishness. We are all so gung ho about this. And most of the people pushing and advancing rapid or large scale technological disruption, you just have to look at their incentives. If you look at the Silicon Valley, for instance, right, the incentives are financial. Really large businesses and megacorps pushing for all kinds of technological advancement, quote unquote. If the incentives are financial, how can they be social? That's very rare. Financial incentives can align with social incentives, but it's very rare. And when you have multi-mega billion-dollar large-scale megacorps pushing for technological advancement, like Charlie Munger once said, right? Show me the incentive, I'll show you the outcome. That is really what is literally playing out here. When it comes to state adoption of technology policy, you look at the kind of policies that are discussed, tech stuff, wherever it may be, in the US, EU, in India. These are worked on and pushed by lawmakers and policy folks and bureaucrats and politicians and a lot of large business special interest groups, right? Very few people pushing for tech policy, deeply embedding tech in the techno-legal system, have any understanding of technology. I mean, forget technical understanding of what is current today, what sort of technologies are current today, etc., etc. I'm saying even a meta-philosophical understanding of technology, to even understand, to even comprehend some of the pitfalls of large-scale digitization. And yet it has become like a big deal for nation states. India is very gung-ho about digital India, which is a very broad umbrella term of rapidly adopting technology. So many of these rapid adoption solutions to problems help solve a lot of problems in a country like India. But are we putting in enough thought into the nth order effects of large scale interconnectedness of digital system in such an immature discipline where citizens' lives and rights are, at stake over a period of decade or 2 decades or 3 decades? I don't think so. And it's just not an Indian phenomenon, it's a global phenomenon. If you just look at all the legislation being pushed around encryption in the US or EU, it's very clear that these are not really technical matters, they are political matters. Now, imagine if a similar system existed for something like cardiac surgery. Would we allow people who have absolutely no clue of cardiac surgery to define very strict prescriptions for how cardiac surgery should be done? We would never. But with technology and digital systems, everybody has an opinion and everybody is able to push these things through. So I think society will go through many cycles of catastrophes before we finally understand, just like with everything else that humanity has faced.
Thanks, Kailash, for that. A very nice response. And there's a follow up to that as well. So, you have argued that regulatory and policy stances that force organizations to adopt solutions as a compliance checkbox exercise without technical nuance is not a good approach. Why is this the case? Can you elaborate on this argument?
Again, it's a classic, that classic adage, forget the exact words. When a measurement becomes the goal or metric becomes the goal, I forget the exact words. But it's that exact same thing. When somebody tells you, you have to do this one thing without really understanding or, delving into the nuances, then you start doing that one thing because you're asked to. You don't care about doing it the right way. You don't care about its implications. You don't care about its depth or nuance. You just do it because it's a compliance thing. That is the nature of compliance. For instance, maybe I can cite a concrete example. OTP, SMS OTP is a big deal in India. Every single tech problem somehow ends up with an SMS OTP as a solution, QR codes and OTPs, right? These are two very specific technologies. There was no QR code in widespread use 10 years ago or 15 years ago. SMS wasn't used in this manner for OTPs at a large scale 10 years ago. Maybe as technology evolves 10 years from now, there'll be something else. And the point of, let's say, using SMS OTPs is to establish, some sort of veracity, validity, identification, authorization, etc. A lot of concepts just rolled into one. So when there's a prescription saying that if you're offering a service to your end users, you have to use SMS OTP, that is bad. If the prescription is a principle saying when offering a service to end users, you should ensure strong two-factor authentication. And here are some recommendations for valid ones, saying cryptographic TOTP or YubiKey, or hardware keys, whatever. That makes sense. But if you force every single person to use that one specific piece of technology or methodology, everybody should use a QR code, everybody should use an SMS. How's that even valid? How's that even viable? That's like saying every single organization should drive the exact same car. It's the same thing. It's a ridiculous example. Or every single organization should use the exact same model of a certain computer or the exact same pen. That would be ridiculous. So how is it possible or viable or meaningful to say that every single organization should do this exact same thing? One infuriating example that all of us are annoyed by are the forced password resets. Every 2-3 months, your bank forces you to change your passwords. That's a terrible security practice. Today, there's so much technical and scientific, even psychological evidence that that is bad and reduces security. But there's a mandate diktat somewhere, and all the organizations just follow it. They impose ridiculous password rules. It should be between 6 characters and 10 characters. Some of my passwords are 50 characters. That's better for security, right? But somebody at some point had a diktat saying 6 to 10. That's so ridiculous. These things become outdated overnight. There, the prescription should have been strong password should be a policy. And here are some recommendations. And organizations and people should be free to explore even stronger things, right? So technical prescriptions, extremely precise tech prescriptions are bad. Regulations can force interoperability. In the EU, there's a thing called open banking, where all banks have been forced by legislation to open up access via interoperable, APIs. There are standards laid out for that. That is great. So you prescribe saying that you should be open and everybody should get together to come up with a standard that everybody follows. Now, if you produce a thing saying you should be open in this particular manner, you should use this technology, you should use this thing, there should be a QR code, there should be an SMS. Now that is bad. That is dead and obsolete on day one, given how rapidly technology changes. And once it becomes policy or legislation, it's extremely difficult to roll it back. So tech policy should be principle based with good recommendations.
Thanks, Kailash. That's a wonderful response again. But I'll now move to a topic different from this one, but something you touched upon in your previous answer, that was about incentive, right? So, wall gardens have a host of issues, but they do make profit at the end of the day, and great profits. Now, how do you address the profit incentive issue in non proprietary software?
It's a difficult problem. It's one of the hottest topics in the open source world is commercial viability and financial sustainability of open source projects. And this has become increasingly hot in the last few years with some big, widely respected and loud open source projects suddenly switching licenses and becoming not open source to chase commercial viability. A large entity can come and pick up a piece of open source software that is maintained by a community of volunteers and make a business out of it and make massive amounts of money and never give anything back to the project. And this has been happening. And it's not a pretty thing. So, in fact, as we speak, this week, a huge drama unfolding in the open source plus tech world is along the same lines. What's happening with WordPress, one of the oldest and the most popular, most widely used open source projects, which people use WordPress for running and maintaining their websites, blogs, etc. It's a content management system. Now there's a fight, and it's just as of yesterday, I think it's become a legal fight between an entity that commercialized it and a nonprofit entity that maintains the project and an entity by the same person who created it, which is also attempting to commercialize it. And there's a fight between. So the incentives are purely financial, nothing to do with the spirit of open source. And it's a very nasty thing that is playing out in the open source world. So these questions don't really have an answer. And I think viability, profit, commercialization, incentives, etc., in the open source world will also evolve over a lot of catastrophes and setbacks and iterations over the next several years. Open source was a niche hacker hobbies thing for many, many, many years. It's only the last maybe 15 years or so where it has become extremely commercial and lucrative. So Microsoft, infamously the enemy of open source, today is one of the biggest supporters of open source. Microsoft has poured unlimited money into the open source ecosystem, and their motives are financial. But when it aligns with open source and community, it's a bit of a win-win. But it's too early to say anything. So GitHub, the largest open source platform, code sharing platform in the world, is owned and operated by Microsoft. NPM, one of the largest software registries, open source software registries in the world, Microsoft. Visual Studio Code, the most popular, biggest open source code editor used by everyone in the world, Microsoft, and on and on and on. So it's really complex, and how all of these different actors with different incentives, different things, opposite ideologies, the spirit of open source versus for-profit incentives, how they all converge, and I hope in a good way, it's yet to be seen. And I think it's unfolding right now. The last 5 years, like I said, these conversations have been hot, and probably over the next decade or so, we will see how it unfolds. I don't have clear answers. I have some thoughts around this, idea of, there are experiments, there's sponsorships, there's open collective, there's an entire host of VC funded open source companies that are coming out, different competing models that are playing out right now. So we just have to wait for the dust to settle.
Kailash, what about the not-for-profit model pushed by a Signal, for instance? And that has been hugely successful, right? So would something like that work?
So Signal is a service, and there are tons of not-for-profits in the open source world. Apache Foundation, one of the largest software collectives foundations in the world, that's a non-profit. And pretty much every large open source software project out there that has become really large has a non-profit foundation attached to it. It's just a natural alignment. Once you set that up and once you move the control, and future of a certain project to a non-profit foundation, you're setting the goals, you're setting the guidelines, you're setting the incentive explicitly and transparently on day one. But we all know that OpenAI started out as a non-profit and now they are switching to a for-profit. So those things can also happen. So Signal is a service. It's a very sensitive service used by a lot of people where things of really critical matters of privacy, free speech, surveillance, etc., come into play. So it makes sense for something like a Signal to be a nonprofit to set all of these incentives, align all of these incentives on day one. Would you trust a very large for-profit corporation whose incentive is for profits to preserve end user privacy? It's very difficult. You can do it, but at some point, profit and the headaches that come with having the obligation to maintain that profit will come in the way of missions. So the nonprofit model fits a lot of use cases. It's not really the solution for everything. Again, right tool for the right job.
Let's at this point, since we're talking about models and companies, profit and incentive, let's take this discussion towards India's private sector. What lessons do you think India's private sector should learn from the global tech outage? I know it was not very much impacted from this tech outage, but still there must be lessons for future tech outages that we should learn.
I think there are no India-specific lessons from the CrowdStrike outage. It has lessons for the entirety of all humanity, not just technologists, everyone. Decentralization is extremely, extremely important. It's not just one of those activist ideologies or terminologies. It's the only way for really large, complex systems to move ahead. The more you centralize, the higher the risk. And the more you decentralize, the more distributed risk is. So that's a very common sense thing, and it plays out very easily in the tech world. So I think that is largely the lesson for everyone, including the Indian private sector.
Thanks, Kailash, for that. I'll ask you the last question
Yeah.
of today's podcast. Do you think it should be the government's business as a regulator, lawmaker, developer, and a major user itself to favor one side over the other in the open source versus proprietary software tussle?
Again, this has no clear answer because this entire discipline is so new. We really haven't understood the implications of large scale tech usage, and everything is early, including our ideas of legislating technology. I mean, this whole thing about how to regulate AI, nobody even knows where to begin. So these are all experiments. But that said, the way you described it, that's a bundle of conflict of interest. If the state itself is the consumer, producer, user, legislator, that's judge, jury, executioner. So that is extremely, extremely complex, which is why there has to be insane amounts of nuance when it comes to tech policy making. But should states favor open source versus proprietary? I think, again, there's abundant evidence that open source is the way to go. If something is out there, open, transparent, public, free of encumbrances, free of royalties, free of licenses, something that gives you liberty, something that gives nation states themselves the liberty to be not beholden to private vendors, I mean, that's a no-brainer for society and an individual and the state itself, right? I'm a I'm a proponent of public money, public code. If my tax money and the tax money of the citizens of this country or any country for that matter is being used to build stuff, build and create technology, I think ethically and morally, maybe even legally, it is only right for that code to be open source. If the government creates technology by itself using citizens' money, then the technology should belong to citizens. The source should be out there. It should be open source software. So there's also that.
Thanks, Kailash. I agree that it doesn't have any clear answers, but yeah, certain approaches, as you rightly highlighted, can be followed. With that, I would like to bring this episode to conclusion, but with certain last thoughts that I'd like to share. First, Kailash here has dabbled in software for decades now, and if he asks us to be humble about it and asks us to think about how software is very new as a discipline, has to undergo a very long evolutionary journey before we can make sense. I think it's time for us to eat the humble pie. That is first. And second, I encourage the listeners to think about this. Just check your systems, whichever you use, how many software have you provided kernel level access? And kernel is like the lowest level of code that's running in your operating system. So just check that out and see how many apps and softwares you have given that access to, and see if that surprises you. With that, I'll bring this to a conclusion. Thank you, Kailash. You were phenomenal. Thank you for your enriching and insightful responses. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.